Hi guys, welcome back. So in this lesson, what I'm going to deal with is the data type conversion. So in the last lesson, we dealt with data types. If you look towards the left, I've renamed the files. That's lesson 1.2 and data types conversion. So in this lesson, I'm going to discuss the type conversion. So I have these first few statements that are quite important. Implicit conversion happens automatically when Python promotes a low data type, e.g. from integer to float. And the next one says explicit conversion requires functions like int, float, str, string, that's bool and boolean. So as we go along, you sort of understand what this means. So we'll start with integer to float conversion. We'll go into integer to boolean conversion. We'll go into converting numeric string to an integer, converting a numeric string to a float, integer to string, and processing it in the next lesson differently. Mathematical calculations, which we cannot really experience here until later classes. And then we have a few statements we need to review. The first two, which we reviewed at the top there. So we'll just repeat it after going through the entire exercises. So I'll start from the beginning here, which is integer to float conversion. Or just to comment that. And when so for instance, what I'll do is first of all comment this out, this two. And when we look at this, we look at num8 equals 10, num-float equals 2.5, result equals num8 plus num-float. Now you notice that num8 is an integer, right? Because it has no decimal place added to it. Num-float has a .5 after 2, that's what makes it a float. But what happens here is that there's a subtle conversion here. And what happens that eventually the result becomes 12.5, which is a float. So how come we have an int and a float? So what Python basically does is that it converts the int into a float. The plus sign, the plus symbol is defined for either an integer or a float. In other words, the float data type has a definition for what to do with the plus sign. The integer data type has a definition for what to do with the plus sign, but there is no integer data type conversion definition for what the plus does. So the system needs to convert both of these either to an int or to a float. But as you see in the statement, implicit conversion happens automatically when Python promotes a lower data type to a higher one. So int is lower, float is higher. And what that means is that int takes a bit lower space in RAM, float takes a bit more space in RAM. And so what it does is that it converts int subtly into a float and then does this conversion. So if we were to run this, and you see that the result of this is a 12.5. But then when we'll comment this and run this again, I will comment the next line, run that again. I see it's an int, so non-int remains an integer. Moving on to the next one, I'll comment this out. Comment this. And you see integer to boolean conversion. So you have num equals 0, print boolean num. So what you have here is that the num is first converted to boolean and then we print out the result. So if you remember from last sessions, I did mention that 0 equals a false in boolean. So we're expecting to see false there. And then when the value is greater than 0 and you do a boolean, you get a true. So if I run this, we expect it to get false and true. So that's fine. Right, the next one, quick 25, which is within double quotes. That makes a numeric string. And then you have num8 equals int of num string. So there is a conversion happening here. Int is being used to convert this into an integer and then it's to be installed in here. So if we were to comment this out, I will print it num8, we'll get a 25. So if we're going to print out num string, I'll just remove the last bit here. And when let's remove the type. We already know it's a string, but let's see what it prints out. So it still shows as 25. The quotes are not there. So when it prints as an integer, you see it prints as 25. When it prints as a string, it prints as 25. But ideally, the system knows that this value here is a string, that is an integer, because by the RAM memory space, this is allocated for an integer which is smaller, and this is allocated for a string, which is basically the number of memory spaces for the number 2, the character 2, and then character 5. So if we continue to the next line, I'll uncomment this. Print type num, we expected to see it printed as an integer. Yep, int. And when we do a print type num string, obviously we expect it to print as a string. Yep, so it remains as a string. So I'll comment that out. Moving on to the next one. Now str source 12.3 for in quotes, that's a numeric string. So num float equals float num string, num str. So in other words, what we're doing here is doing the conversion to float and then storing value in here. But num str still retains its former data type, which is a numeric string, or rather just a string. So if we print out the value of num float, it's going to be printed as a float, and then when we print out the type, it's supposed to print out a float type. Yep, so we have a float type. Okay, hope that's clear. Moving on to integer to string, equals 25, print type age, and then we have a message there that says I am plus strh plus years old, and then you have a print message. If I run this, let's see what it looks like. So it says the type of the variable age is an integer, and then you can concatenate this string together. In other words, join them together to create a string. So if I were to remove this, you already see that there is a bit of problem. The underline there indicates that the age is not supposed to be there. So if I run this, we will encounter an error that says type error can only concatenate string, not into string. So in other words, this is considered an integer. It cannot add it to a string. So we'll have to put this back to make that conversion possible, and then we can print out the message there. So this is about converting integers to string. You need to do a clear conversion to a string. So I'll comment that out. Next line is talk about converting strings to Boolean. I think we've seen this before as well. An empty string just indicates a false, and a string with content in it is just true. I would suggest you use that to represent true or false. Just use a 1 or 0, or true, clear, through, and false, and that should be fine. So I'll leave that and move to the next one. Processing user input simply means taking user input and using the value to perform some computations. And you use the input function for that. That's the input function. So when this says enter age, it gives you a question mark that expects you to enter something, and the value entered goes into age. But the point is that the input function always returns a string. So you usually want to convert that into an integer or float if you're going to compute with it. So I click on run. It says enter your age. If I say 10, and print next year you will be 11, which means that when the value was submitted, was received, was a string, then it was converted to an integer, placed in the same variable age, and then used as an integer here. So because it's an integer here, we can add a 1 to it. So if I were to comment this line out, for instance, put a hash before it, if I write it now, I say 10 again, now we encounter an error because now it cannot understand why it has to add a string to an integer, because we've commented out where we convert it to an integer. So attempts to do that here and then generate an error can only concatenate str, not int to str. So in other words, you need to convert it either to a float or an integer. So if I put a float here, convert it to float, now we stop this and run, and I say 10, It says give me 11.0. So if we were calculating age by year, months, and months being represented by decimals, then this makes more sense. But usually we compute age as an integer value, so that's why we want to have an int conversion here rather than a float. If it was a temperature, for instance, you would probably use a float. So comment that out. And coming to the last one here, mathematical calculations, price times 15. Usually you have dot 15 there, but let's run this and see what this looks like. So the result of multiplication by dot 15 is that, and the class type of that is considered an integer. So if we were to make this 0.15, which is more 15%, I'll make it a 7.75%. That's a discount. And then run it again. Now, what do we actually expect to see here as a type of this? When I run this, you get a class float because now we multiply it with a floating value and it converts it, even though this is already an integer, converts it into a float. And this is what we get as discount 14.25. So if I were to remove this conversion here, automatically we get what? We get float anyway, because this is coming as a float, and then we're multiplying with a float. Ultimately, this will also become a float. So I'll just put that back. That brings us to the end of this session. The remaining items here are just statements you need to be aware of. Now, so I've read this earlier, so I'm just going to read it again based on context of what we've gone through. So implicit conversion happens automatically when Python promotes a lower data type, e.g. int to float. So it makes more sense now since we've gone through that bit. You understand what it means to convert from int to float. Explicit conversion requires functions like int, float, str, and bool. And we did go through several of that. Now, beyond these two, converting strings to numbers is useful when working with the user input. You did see that under the user input line. Converting numbers to strings is necessary for text formatting or concatenation. That's another term for it. That's concatenation. Boolean conversions help evaluate conditions in Python. So you have a true false, and it determines whether the program goes ahead. So in this session, we've gone through type conversion, and in the next session, we'll go through user input and output. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Cheers, bye.